So I'm going to dive straight into my talk, which is titled ChatGPT is my little helper. That is a quote that came directly from one of the participants in the study that I'm going to talk about today, which aimed to understand our students' experiences and attitudes towards generative AI and its use. But in particular, I'm going to be focusing on the EDI strand of this particular project. So the reason for this project is we've come at it from a couple of different lenses and a couple of different strands. So this sits within a larger project that aims to generally understand how students are using ChatGPT and other forms of generative AI in psychology. But the strand that I'm leading on looks at particularly neurodivergent students. So looking at how neurodivergent students with a particular focus on autism and ADHD are using generative AI during their studies. So the main background for this came from looking at some of the academic barriers that are specifically faced by neurodivergent students while they're at university. So we do have some background on this from Clowder et al. From 2020. They conducted a really nice narrative synthesis of the literature to date that looks at the experiences of neurodivergent students, primarily autistic and ADHD students, within the realm of higher education. And they identified three main themes, which they considered to be barriers that were being experienced by these students, specifically the neurodivergent ones. So they found that the experience of neurodivergent students within higher education was very difficult. There was a lot of barriers that they expressed frustration with when it came to things like accessing specific support for their learning. They pretty much universally discussed experiences around stigma, so being stigmatized, particularly on disclosing the difficulties that they were facing. This came with additional difficulties as far as emotional distress and additional stress were concerned. And many of them also reported difficulties with communication and engaging with academic life in general, often as a result of those difficulties with communication. So this included things like difficulties and differences in information processing. Particularly the ADHD students reported difficulties with directing and shifting attention and engaging in cognitive flexibility. The students also discussed the higher education and the academy's response to their neurodiversity. So not every student chose to disclose their difficulties to the institution, but those that did experienced some difficulties accessing reasonable adjustments. Some of them were very reluctant to disclose because of past experiences around stigma and prejudice and discrimination as a result. Lots of them reported a lack of experience and some inflexibility on behalf of their lecturers as well. They also discussed the teaching and learning and assessment strategies, particularly from a view that they struggled with inclusivity. So they found that the assessments that they were being given were typically tailored towards neurotypical students, and they found that they were relying on technology either through formal support plans or that they'd sourced themselves to support them with things like reading, writing, and planning for assessments. So this idea of them becoming reliant on technology, either from the perspective of student support services or things that they'd sourced themselves, leads us into asking the question, well, we've got generative AI now, it's becoming more and more prevalent. So how might generative AI models be used to help neurodivergent students? Well, the evidence is still in its infancy, but like the generative AI models themselves, it's updating quickly and we're getting new information all the time. And so far, it seems that neurodivergent students might find things like large language models like ChatGPT and generative AI helpful and supportive to their studies. So Clowder et al. Sort of touched on this a little bit in their review, but they argued that neurodivergent students may be more likely to use things like ChatGPT because it provides and is capable of providing what the students see as being individualized and personalized support, but also that it is impartial. It doesn't stigmatize or label neurodivergent students either implicitly or explicitly, which is something that they previously identified as being a barrier to students engaging with help. ChatGPT can also, to an extent, be individualized towards that student's specific support needs. So we know, for example, that autistic students often benefit from being monitored by a personal coach or having a personal support worker with them, depending on the difficulties they experience, whereas ADHD students tend to prefer interactive interventions. This can create disparities both between those different groups of students, but also we know that no one-size-fits-all solution fits even within autism or within ADHD. There's a different spectrum and there's a different pattern of difficulties that people may face. And ChatGPT can, to an extent, individualize the support that people need depending on their diverse needs. So how might generative AI models actually help students? What do we know so far? This is some data from Jesse. They argue in 2024 that AI could be used by students and educators to create what they describe as neuro-inclusive environments, specifically by bridging communication differences for autistic students, but also they may look at helping ADHD students with things like navigating planning, navigating procrastination, and things like that. So it's important for us as educators to be aware of how neurodivergent students are using generative AI and how we can ensure that it's used appropriately and with the appropriate caveats and things and the appropriate awareness in place, particularly around its limitations. So we also note that different approaches when teaching neurodivergent students how to use ChatGPT might be beneficial because different types of neurodiversity differ in terms of how they prefer their approaches. But we also need to look at spreading awareness to neurodivergent students around the potential risks that are associated with relying on ChatGPT. So when we think about things like over-reliance on it in terms of relying on it to produce your assessments, it might start off with students using it to plan, to structure, to get them started on work. What we don't want is them falling down that kind of slippery slope into using ChatGPT to simply produce the work for them. But we also want to highlight to students that it's not something that should be considered a replacement for any kind of therapeutic or psychological or emotional support. So it shouldn't be something that can be seen as being instead of a professional providing therapeutic intervention. So this is where our study came in. We wanted to look directly at what students are doing with generative AI, particularly ChatGPT, because that seems to be the most common one at the moment that students are using. And in this case, we focused primarily on neurodivergent students. So what we did was we gathered lots of qualitative data through a series of interviews with neurodivergent students and also from focus groups with groups of neurodivergent students as well. But I'm going to be focusing today on the data that we got from the interviews. The interviews themselves were facilitated by an undergraduate student that fit into one of the strands that we were looking for. So this was conducted, like I say, as part of a larger study. One of the other strands that we did this for looked at international student experiences and engagement with ChatGPT. So those focus groups were all facilitated by an international student who in this case was Chinese. And the interviews and the focus groups with neurodivergent students were hosted by a neurodivergent undergraduate student as well. We also had undergraduate students work through the data and through the transcripts under supervision of staff, including myself. They conducted a reflexive thematic analysis, which we're going to contrast later on with deeper analysis from an educator, probably me, using interpretive phenomenological analysis. So here are some example questions. We would ask students how they use AI in their studies. We did ask them to focus, like I say, on generative AI and gave them ChatGPT as an example. We asked them if they found AI and generative AI particularly useful for students like you. So in terms of the things that you struggle with, do you find that generative AI is helpful to you? And can you tell us in what ways it's helpful to you? And we also asked them whether or not they think AI is beneficial for their learning, has it influenced their motivation, and how do they see it progressing in terms of things like their assessments. So here's the data, the demographics rather, from the participants that we included in this analysis. The data that I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides comes from these participants down here. So primarily our neurodivergent students. So you can see we've got a good mix. We've got students who are autistic, albeit only one autistic student, a couple of ADHD students, and also most of our students have some mixed neurodivergence within that as well. So one of the first things we want to do moving forward is get a few more autistic students in. But for our preliminary analysis, this is fine. So far we've identified 4 key themes as being present in terms of understanding neurodivergent students' experiences with AI. And I'm going to go through each one in turn, along with a couple of quotes from students to kind of illustrate what they were telling us. So our first theme we've described as achieving the academic win. And within this theme, our students were telling us that they use generative AI and ChatGPT to help them to get over those barriers, to help them achieve what they describe as an academic win. Now, this can be both practical, so helping them with planning, engaging, understanding language. So I'll go through some examples of that in just a second. But it can also be the psychological implications. So a few of them were discussing things like the stress and the worry and the anxiety they have around starting assignments with ChatGPT before they actually engaged with it. So in terms of planning, students were using it to help them summarize their notes, to summarize their ideas, to break down their ideas, and in some cases help them with generating ideas. Some of our students who were included in the sample experienced things like dyslexia and dyscalculia, so they were using it with helping them with language, particularly around grammar and spelling. I think this is important because we know this aligns quite nicely with what we know about these practical skills as being key predictors of academic success. So using something to help level the playing field, if you like, overcoming these barriers, potentially means we can look at closing an attainment gap that neurodivergent students are experiencing. But as I alluded to earlier, the students did talk about engaging with ChatGPT from a psychological perspective as well and getting some mental health support. So this does factor into that awareness I was talking around earlier, maybe ensuring students are aware that they need to take that into account, the limitations of ChatGPT there. So here's an example of one of our students, the ADHD, dyslexia and dyscalculia student. They described using ChatGPT to help with planning. It helps give me ideas. It helps me to structure my things, deal with my executive dysfunction, and it helps me to prepare for seminars as well. We also had students using it for language, so worried about being marked on things like spelling and grammar, helping them with phrasing. So again, kind of leveling that playing field and allowing them to focus on other things that help them to get that academic win. Other students described using ChatGPT and AI as a supportive buddy. So this is more they're using it as a way of keeping accountability. So it helped to motivate them and help them to initiate completion of the academic work. They found that this was better than relying on their academic peers and lecturers because it could provide more tailored responses. It's also relatively impartial, so it removes any stigma or any judgment. And it's also freely accessible whenever they need it. This seemed to be particularly beneficial for the ADHD students who often experience something called front-end perfectionism, which is where they tend to wait until perfect conditions arise before they begin on a task. ChatGPT as this sort of accountability buddy helped them to overcome that. So here's an example from one of our participants. They've asked it to review their work as if it was a lecturer teaching a second year student. And it helps because lecturers are not available 24 hours a day. It's free and it's something that everyone can access, not just neurodivergent students, which I think is kind of an interesting perspective to take. Now, some students did highlight their concerns around using it as a substitute for themselves or as a substitute for their own work. Some students in this case were discussing generative AI as a second set of hands, which could be taken as using it to just write assessments, write the essays for them. However, that was fairly limited in our sample. We didn't really see students saying that they were using it to write assessments. It was more about planning it and overcoming those initial hurdles and getting their thoughts together and planning assessments. So I do think that this theme may well become a bit more relevant and potentially more problematic in time as more and more advanced generative AIs emerge and people become potentially more reliant on it. But it is worth pointing out that our participants challenged this idea. They were aware of the risk of becoming more reliant on generative AI. And they did identify this as being an issue around laziness. That's their words, not mine. So this is an example again from an ADHD student who also experiences dyslexia. They argued that at this point, it just helps me to get started, but it might make me a bit lazy in terms of relying on it to do things that I should have just done on my own. So I think they're aware of this risk of it completely overtaking all work that they want to do. And finally, in theme 4, our participants identified ChatGPT as a compensatory tool, so sort of a fallback to safety line or as a safety net. They saw it as being something that could help them to compensate for difficulties that they've felt that they were experiencing. They saw it as a net so that they could sort of overcome those difficult things and focus on where they were stronger. So for example, in our ADHD group, we see them they know they struggle with planning, prioritizing and getting started, but once they're in, they can hyper focus on it and really go into depth with their essays and with their writing and with their work. So using ChatGPT to overcome those initial difficulties then allows them to play it to their strengths. So it's not in this case about a total reliance on generative AI. And they highlight that quite nicely here. So it just takes away that element and you're actually just focusing on your ideas and your content becomes good as a result. So in future, what I would like to do with this work is, as I say, the first thing that we're trying to do is include some more autistic participants in the sample and then engage with the educator analysis using IPA instead. I think it would also be useful to look at the impacts of different types of AI. We had some students talking about things like spell check AI and things like that alongside ChatGPT. I think it would also be useful to look at it in more traditional corporate settings, so how they're using it to manage things like placements, work experience. Do they manage it in graduate school as well? Similar to that, I would also like to do some longitudinal studies to kind of track how their attitudes and their use of AI is changing as the AI itself changes in terms of its capabilities. And eventually, we would like to do some experimental designs looking at potential causal factors that influence people's use of AI, looking at things like individual differences in personality, their political ideology. Some of them had very strong ethical views around using generative AI as well, but also motivations and things like that will also play an interesting role, I think, in determining how students, and particularly how neurodivergent students, are using generative AI. So hopefully we can see it's not all doom and gloom. They're using it in a supportive capacity rather than to just write essays for them, which is always nice to see. But thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sophie. Do we have any questions for Sophie? Jamie and then Liam.
Hello, yes, Sophie, thank you. I really enjoyed that talk.
Thank you.
So thank you. I experience front-end perfectionism with writing, and I made an investment of Grammarly Pro, and this is a grammar software that is AI powered, and it has increased my productivity considerably. Now that I can just think about, as a neurodiverse person, putting my ideas onto the page, and then actually this creates some coherence out of the chaos. However, I think with our students, I think we should get into the habit of communicating to them that AI is sort of a bit like a cautious ally. Because without a really robust knowledge of how it works, without a really robust knowledge of even the curriculum, I think sometimes students can get into the habit of thinking they're using it appropriately, and actually it's not helping them at all. They're misusing it. It's not helping them in their assignments. So where's the line with sort of saying, okay, well, for neurodiverse students, this can be a great tool when used effectively, versus, well, actually, this is not the appropriate use of AI.
Yeah, so one of the things I think is really helpful, and I've seen some other institutions do this as well, is they will actually go through this with students during induction. So say to them, this is what we know so far about how people are using AI. Here's an appropriate way of doing it. Some cases they'll say, here's the sorts of prompts you can use in ChatGPT that will actually be helpful for you. Here's what you can and can't do, looking at policy around generative AI use. I think that is usually the better way to go. I think when this first kind of took off, everyone was very like, no, you must absolutely not use it. And then students are just going to use it anyway, but they're going to go in blind and use it in all kinds of ways. Grammarly is an interesting one. A couple of the students did mention that in this study, but we focused primarily on the generative AI. But I know some of the students will use ChatGPT, especially when English isn't the first language. They'll go through ChatGPT and ask it to correct any errors that they've made. I think the language thing for me that was the most interesting was the one autistic student that we had discussed how they found sometimes that feedback on assignments wasn't direct enough. We were being too nice and too fluffy. So they would put the feedback into ChatGPT and basically say, tell me what this actually wants me to do, make it direct and make it blunt. Which as an autistic person, I really appreciate it because I get told my feedback is too blunt. So yeah, I think the line really is around that awareness and telling students this is what we can use it for, this is appropriate, this is where it'll be helpful, this is maybe where you need to be a bit more careful.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Sophie, that was really interesting. Can you hear me? I've no idea if folks can hear me. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, you were a little bit tinny.
Yeah.
Like you're underwater.
Sorry, my mic is not the best. Is it all right? Or I can put my questions in the chat if that's going to be better.
I think I can work it out.
Cool, grand. Yeah, no, really fascinating, really interesting. your table of your participants. I saw like in your 5 neurodiverse cases, there's like a really range of usage between hundreds of hours. And I wondered how much that related a bit to what Jamie was talking about in terms of awareness or education around using it. And I do think you partly answered the question I wanted to ask about, like, how do we do this in terms of actually not all AI is bad, but teaching responsible use. And did you get a sense of misconceptions about AI as well? Because I noticed some of the stuff you were talking about in the previous literature was around the idea that it's not stigmatized and it's almost kind of taking on this personality, and AI is not. It's like, I've heard other people describe it as really advanced predictive text. And it's also based on the existing corpus of knowledge, which we know is highly biased in terms of some of what's in there. So, what was your sense in the sample of what was modifying people's usage? And I can probably ask, you've already said that.
So I always, when we ask them to sort of estimate how much time they spent using it, I always take that with a grain of salt, because we know people are not very good at estimating how long they spend. Like, I see this in the video game literature as well. People usually underestimate how much time they spend playing video games, watching TV, that kind of thing. I suspect it's probably the same with ChatGPT. So one of the things I think would be really neat is to do that sort of longitudinal study where we know they're going to be spending more and more time using it, and tracking how their attitudes have maybe changed, how what they're using it for has maybe changed, how they feel about it has maybe changed as well. Because I think there is an issue with students that they're aware of it as being a potential thing that might happen to them, as well as becoming reliant on it and seeing it as a tailored person on the other end that's helping them. And ChatGPT does very quickly get very good at telling you what you want to hear and saying it in the way that you find helpful, which can be really useful for neurodivergent students, but can also lead to problems down the line. I think definitely I think it's just seen in the chat there, those workshops around teaching students how to and how not to use AI, but also telling them what it actually is and what it isn't. It's in some cases acts like a search engine, and that's okay. But again, needing to be careful with what it actually tells you, and in some cases how it tells you it, I think is really important.
Yeah, one final thought I had is, how much is this about mainstreaming adjustments we will talk about, rather than specific adjustments? Because we end up with, I feel like, a slightly hypocritical position in our institution at the moment, where we allow AI use amongst some groups of individuals who have a notice spatial adjustment of needs, and they can use it for planning. But students who don't have that adjustment can't use it at all. And how much actually, if we just taught everyone to use it responsibly as a planning tool, and step back from it at the right point, it would be a benefit to anyone without any of this kind of, I don't know. I find it confuses me. It must be confusing.
Thank you.
I mean, that's kind of my approach to accessibility and EDI in general, right? If we're making things better for the neurodivergent students, we're making it better for everybody. So why not? Widen it up?
Thank you, Sophie. And it's a lovely sentence to actually end on there perfectly.